grief we go, gotta learn to let it go.
Welcome to Wake the F Up podcast, where we talk about living consciously and helping people uncover their essential selves so that they can stop sleepwalking through life. Welcome back to Wake the F Up. Today we are so honored to be joined by Steph Harland, a somatic trauma practitioner based in the northeast of England, and the voice behind Feels Like Healing. Steph works with women navigating autoimmune disease by helping them regulate their nervous systems and heal the trauma that often lies beneath the chronic illness. Her work is deeply personal, born from the loss of her father to an autoimmune complications, a loss that ignited her mission to help others find relief, connection, and healing in their own bodies. Welcome, Steph. We are so excited to have you on the program, and I just feel like both our missions, both the way we practice, somatically speaking, trauma informed, as well as being experiential, is just so connected. And so I'm just excited to hear your story and share it with our listeners today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. And I think you're absolutely right. It sounds like we're on very similar journeys and have very similar missions. So yeah, it feels really aligned to be here.
You know, one of the things that I probably don't talk about enough on this show because we get so hyper focused into grief and grief journeys is how trauma, when stored in the body and unhealed, can manifest into significant illnesses. And we touch on it a lot, but I was wondering if maybe you could just share a little bit about your background, obviously the loss of your father and what led you to this career and this path and this passion, and maybe talk a little bit about your experience in understanding autoimmune disorders and how trauma is related.
Yeah, of course. So I guess it all started, yeah, about 5.5 years ago when I did sadly lose my dad. And up until that point, I wasn't really aware of trauma, healing. I wasn't, my eyes weren't open to that side of things at that time. But during my own grief process, my dad died just a few months before the pandemic started. So there was no running away and traveling like I would have probably done otherwise. I just had to sit with the feelings, which initially were extremely uncomfortable, as I'm sure you can imagine. And in that time, then started researching, trying to work out what had happened to him, basically. And that's when my eyes were opened to trauma, chronic stress, how that can live in the body when it's unresolved and have this domino effect of physical health issues. It can lead to autoimmune disease, and that's just the aftermath of living for such a long time in that state of chronic stress, survival mode, and having that constantly dysregulated nervous system. So, in my dad's case, there was no doctor or medical professional that could explain to me what had really happened to him. There was sort of always a question mark around it. So, in a bid with my own grief, I suppose, to try and understand what happened to him, that's when it led me down this path and this onto this journey, I suppose, of yeah, in a bid to try and understand what had happened to him. I ended up going on my own very deep personal healing journey and now doing what I'm doing, helping other people, which is, yeah, it's crazy how I suppose one of the most painful things that you can ever experience can then you can sort of turn that pain into power and a way to help others, which is certainly a way that helped me cope with the grief for sure. But yeah, just to explain a little bit more about how I see how unresolved trauma can cause physical illness, especially autoimmune disease. Um, if you can imagine that obviously when we're younger, especially in childhood, we all may go through adverse experiences and have traumatic events happen to us. And when that goes unresolved and there's no safe person there to help you through that, um, this can, it shapes the way that our nervous systems are wired. So before we know it, we're then teenagers and then go into adult life with these subconscious wounds that we're not even really aware of that then can dictate our entire lives. So you've got the unresolved trauma that then causes a chronically dysregulated nervous system, you might notice you're getting triggered a lot of anxiety or irritability or anger issues, perhaps. Or on the other hand, maybe a sense of feeling numb, depressed, frozen, just a bit stuck, lots of procrastination, things like that might be coming up for you. And over time, as we live with that dysregulation, then that has a very physical effect on the body. It increases our inflammation levels, it can affect our hormones. Um, and your body is literally living in that state of stress and that state of fight or flight where it cannot relax. And over time, as the years pass, this is when things can then develop into physical disease and illness when these things go unnoticed and unresolved.
Did you always, or were you aware, I guess is the question I'm going to ask, that your father had a significant trauma history, or was it, I'm imagining like most fathers, they, men can often shove their emotional states and even their trauma histories kind of, they put it on a back burner or find a way to compartmentalize. In your father's health complications, did you know that he had chronic stress or any trauma history?
I think at the time, I sort of just shrugged my shoulders at it a little bit of, oh yeah, he's maybe been through a few difficult things, but it doesn't seem to really bother him right now. And yeah, he's always maybe a bit stressed, but that's just my dad and that's just how he is. So it's not until I've obviously gained all this knowledge and then looked back on his life and experiences that all the pieces have been put together. And it's such a strange feeling, I suppose. And at first, I almost struggled with it because although it was a relief to understand and have, I suppose, an answer as to what had happened to him, there was almost a sense of frustration as well of why couldn't I have known this information back then? I could have helped him, I could have saved him, which I know is not completely logical thinking, but that's grief for you, I suppose.
Totally. And I wonder if it isn't a major part of tragic death or grief stories in general. I mean, I think all of us who are grievers are always trying to make sense of things that often don't make sense, right? Sometimes there just is no sense about a death and a why. And we look for the why. Like I know in my own journey, I think I felt the very same thing about Carl in some ways. Like he had this, my husband that passed had this extremely hardworking, super intelligent, kind of almost got it perfect all the time. And I don't know that I ever connected to that while we were married and he was alive. It wasn't until we really got into therapy at the later end of his life when his anxiety was really tough. And I thought the anxiety was coming from the cancer journey, the illness. And the truth is that actually, when I look back, the skills that I have now, had I have had words or understanding at the time, yeah, I often wonder if there was, ways to help or ways that I could have been a better wife and a bit more of a support system. And I think that's a natural, right? We always can look back and have to kind of grieve that part of ourselves that wasn't evolved enough or aware enough to understand. And time is kind of strange and painful in that way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally relate to that. And I think that's something that a lot of people will probably relate to, that feeling of helplessness, I suppose, of, oh, if I could just jump back into the past with what I know now, I could fix everything. But I guess that is just not how life works.
It's not, and simultaneously as my children are working through their grief and their own right trauma histories, I witness as they're becoming teenagers, especially, and my teen children. Healing is a choice, and it's funny because we just talked pre-show like certification and education, and it doesn't matter how much information I have under my belt. I've armored myself with as much information and research as I can to help my children and myself so that I could be the most alive or informed caregiver to my family and myself and show up for my kids the best I can. And it doesn't really matter though. Like the more I study, the more I understand that it takes embodiment, it takes listening, in the same way. And it also takes a choice. Like you can have all the tools and until my kids are ready, and maybe your father and Carl as well, right? Like for whatever reason, it's sad that we're not always prepared. And trauma can really freeze you up to the point where it feels almost impossible to make any normal daily functioning choices. And yeah, it takes really subtle things to defrost, I'm learning. And that's pretty much the opposite of who I am as a person. So like the more that I study, the more I understand that like even my own trauma response is hard, fast, and intense. And my healing has come in like the most subtle somatic work, which is so interesting.
Yeah, I completely resonate with that. I think I went through a similar stage, especially at the start of my healing journey, where I wanted to know all of the information. I wanted to do every training I possibly could. And then it wasn't until a few years down the line where I noticed that was probably a bit of a trauma response in itself, of just arming myself with all of this information that in the moment somehow made me feel better, as if there was still a part of me stuck in the past thinking, I'm going to solve this and I'm going to save him, when obviously heartbreakingly that's just not possible. And I guess it's not lost on me that there is probably a part of me that's doing the work I'm doing now and helping others, um, to try and save my dad in a way, if that makes sense, by helping other people. But so sometimes I have to catch myself with that to make sure the balance is right. Obviously, it lights me up so much to help other people heal and to share this somatic work with others. But sometimes I do have to catch myself that I'm not doing too much from a place of a trauma response, if that makes sense.
It totally does. In fact, I think my entire mission is very similar to help others. And I always think about like if I can give back one tick, of something that I wish that I would have had that would have eased the pain. That it makes my work feel that much more valuable. But I also think you're right. Like often understanding and educating and working to make something better is a control piece, and so it is definitely a trauma response. But you know, I always think that's kind of like how life works. There's always like this positive charge, and there's also on the back end like a battery, like a negative charge, just like the thing that drives us, that makes us like wonderful and who we are. There's also sometimes a negative charge to that where you're like, can I keep this in a healthy manner? And somatic work is interesting. When you become a somatic practitioner, you really have to check yourself. Are you being embodied? And so in my company, we work on this thing called the love framework, which is kind of like an internal acronym on what I've found to be true is that if you learn to love yourself, you're able to actually heal from your grief in the ways that it stops choke holding you. The grief will, of course, never go away, but it's something it's something around internal work and somatic work and body practices. So I was wondering, in your practice, in your coaching, how do you like to guide your clients who are in grief or in trauma, to listen inside of their selves, and how do you get them to tap into the somatics?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think every client is completely different, as I'm sure you resonate with. And it is like a very intuitive practice. Even if it's the same client, just a different session the week after, it can be a completely different vibe and a completely different mood. So every session is very intuitive from my perspective to really sense where they're at, if they're if they have enough capacity to go to certain places. Um, and I like to use the phrase less is more and slower is faster, because I think with this work, it's so crucial and vitally important to not rush someone into feeling something that their nervous system doesn't have the capacity to hold yet, if that makes sense. So I always take a very steady and a very gentle approach. And yeah, in terms of tapping into their body, it completely depends where the client's at. Sometimes people are naturally very in tune with themselves and very aware with what they're feeling. And sometimes people may be so frozen in that trauma response that they can't quite feel anything. And when you ask a question such as, where do you feel that in your body? Sometimes people just don't know how to answer that if that's something they've never done before. It's like learning a new language, I suppose. Um, so I always start at the very outside edge and judge where people are at, and then just follow my own intuition as to where to guide that, and um, how far they're ready to go, if that makes sense.
And you're still primarily working with women who have autoimmune disorders, or do you just like to do trauma in general?
That's right. So typically, the people that I work with do have autoimmune disease or some sort of chronic illness, not all the time, but typically. And it's all part and parcel of the same thing. Like I was talking about earlier, um, typically in sessions, we don't actively focus on talking about the disease or the physical impact themselves. We do typically focus on the trauma and their nervous system, that over time, in turn, after a couple of months of working with someone, I'll have clients come back to me saying, oh, these physical symptoms I was getting have completely calmed down. I'm not getting like hot flushes anymore. I'm not getting palpitations anymore. Like, this is incredible. So it never fails to amaze me how doing somatic work and nervous system regulation can have such a physical impact on the body as well.
Absolutely. And when you're with the experience you've had working with autoimmune disorders, what do you find is the body symptomology? So what are you seeing as the somatic expression or the language the body is trying to communicate with the is there a ribbon of similarity across the board where you're heading towards an autoimmune disorder? Can you see these kind of symptoms have a pattern?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I have definitely noticed a few patterns in the people that I work with. I think a big one that I notice in women is when women have some sort of suppressed anger, when there's rage in there that needs to come out. And it can take a while to get to that. In the first few sessions, people may have no idea that it's there. I have no idea that it's there for them either. But as you start peeling back the layers, all of a sudden there's this anger and rage that wants to come out. And typically that's a really big breakthrough moment. And I think when women go for too long suppressing that anger, and that righteous anger that has a very good right to be there most of the time, that can cause chaos in the body.
It's
And
interesting that you say that. Like, I think that I always have thought that anger for me is like a cover emotion. So when you peel back the rage, and I love that you said like righteousness and that, which it's true, right? We have a lot to be angry about as women. And the more that I heal, the more I am feeling my poor husband. He's probably like, I'm turning into this like frustrated feminist often in my life currently because I think by the time you hit 40, you're like, I am tired of this bullshit that's laid all over us as women. And I think I'm lucky to have a supportive partner. But when I peel open my anger, often I find sadness underneath. And I was wondering, is it true anger, or do you find that the layer beneath that is a sadness?
yeah, again, it's a really good point. And I do think I do completely agree that anger is typically a cover emotion. And I think once you pull back those layers, it's, in my experience with my clients, it seems to be a cover emotion for very, very deep rooted sadness and pain, like really getting to the core of some very traumatic and painful experiences and memories that someone may have gone through at a very young age. And I think that being able to release that anger and connect with it, and just sit with it for as long as is comfortable, is the key to being able to then have access to that other part of you that underneath that anger is deeply in pain and feeling intense sadness.
One of the things that I've been so like, so sometimes the people who know me well know that the simplest things, when they land in my nervous system at maybe a time where I can process them or I have embodied understanding of them, blow me away. And I've been studying actually to become a somatic experiencer under Dr. Peter Levine's course, and I'm in the beginnings module, going into beginner two. And one of the things that we recently learned, which was like mind blowing for me. And I've done so many somatic trainings, I can't even think about all the hours I put in. But I finally got the understanding in his program of why it is that we need to heal in the body and not in cognitive therapy. And I thought it's really worth sharing. And I was wondering if this resonates with you, A, and B, if you find like a one embodied practice that you do with your sessions that help people with autoimmune suffering or chronic trauma. So he basically writes in his book, and it's Waking the Tiger is his book, which is really amazing. But in the course, we learned that the deepest part of our brain, the reptilian brain, so the part of our brain that was like the oldest. So as mammals, we've evolved our front brain, our neocortex, and these are where language lies, and in the brain where reasoning and a lot of where emotions, verbal emotions, and connecting on the why things happen. So like you can see, it's in human nature for us to make an understanding of why some trauma has happened in our life, like losing our loved ones. And yet, in the deepest part of our brainstem is where reproduction, so our sexual drive, our need for food, shelter, and our basic needs go. And the sensations of our body, so our nervous system, which regulates fight, flight, and all of our physiological response to keep us safe, that is where trauma is impacted. So when trauma happens, we go back to our animalistic brain, everything else shuts off, and we're overwhelmed in the deepest part of a reptilian brain. And so in that space, there are not words. You cannot necessarily talk out. You can talk it out, and right, the humanistic part of our mammalian brain needs to talk out our trauma to be validated and to be seen. However, you notice more and more you talk it out that you don't necessarily feel better. You're still having PTSD. You're still having these trauma responses until you actually work in the soma, in the body part, and deep into whatever the pattern that's held into your cellular makeup. Like an animal, if you ever watch like deers in the wild, if they're attacked or go into a fight, flight, or freeze state, they do this tremor shaking of their body to release that nervous system energy. So the body is like, if we're frozen, we're stuck and we're holding on. Internally, we're still going through all of this, getting ready to like fight or run. And there's nowhere for that energy to go. And so it's trapped in our body. And it's just been so mind blowing. So knowing that for me, I don't know why, but the science and like having a why sometimes really helps me to see it in the clients. And so you can see these trauma responses in sympathetic, like our anxiety states. It's like, boom, our legs are always bouncing, our eyes are darting around. And in a frozen state, it's like shoulders hunched, struggling to get out of bed. I don't feel like doing anything. Like your body will send these signals. You see this a lot in your clients, and do you mostly get, I would say, in autoimmune, is it mostly like an anxiety, fight or flight response? Or are you seeing a lot of more stuck for so long energy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And just as you were talking there, I was thinking myself about that example where wild animals shake to regulate themselves in the moment. And it's such an important point because, like you say, we as humans, we don't shake, we don't tremor in that moment. We hold on to it for sometimes years or lifetimes. And that causes havoc in the body. And
Totally.
yeah, it's a really good question. And I would say typically, with the people I work with, certainly at first, who have autoimmune disease, it's definitely people who are stuck in that freeze response, that completely like frozen, numb stuckness, which I suppose is the body's way of playing dead in a sense, in
Mhm.
of, back to the caveman days, if you are running away from a lion, but then the lion jumps on you and is about to eat you, then your nervous system will put you into freeze mode and collapse so that you play dead and switch off from the threat. And that is what I see people walking through life in this, what I call functional freeze mode, for sometimes years at a time. And it takes a while sometimes to melt that freeze away. But you can't, in my experience, you can't go straight from freeze mode to safety and regulation. You have to pass through that fight and flight mode before
Mhm.
that safety. So I think sometimes people can feel really unnerved when that freeze mode starts to melt, and then all of a sudden they're met with this anxiety and fear, and the fight or flight mode is kicking in. So it's like you mentioned earlier, having the science and the knowledge behind that to know that that's a very normal part of the process and your nervous system is moving through these stages. And the fact that you did feel frozen but now feel anxious is actually a positive sign that you're moving in the
Right.
right direction towards safety. I think that's really important to reassure people with that during the sessions as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's often I think people practitioners may not understand that you have to go through the sympathetic in order to get up into ventral vagal, and our home is in homeostasis, and the balance of the body wants to get us there, but really like the movement is a huge piece. So I was wondering, like, what is your favorite um like at home technique, or do you have like some modalities that you recommend to your clients that are struggling to get out of frozen? Like, what are your defrost tools?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, like I mentioned earlier, every person is completely different. So there's some somatic tools or exercises I would suggest to one client, and they absolutely love it and it feels great. And the next day can suggest the same thing to someone else and it feels really uncomfortable and their body does not like it at all. So it is a very personal thing and it's based on someone's experiences and their own nervous system. But I think my favorite one would be something that I call the buzz breath, which is very simple. It's just inhaling for 4 seconds through the nose, holding at the top for 4 seconds, and then exhaling through the mouth whilst making a buzzing sound, which
Mhm.
stimulates the vagus nerve. And in an ideal world, that exhale would be really quite long, ideally very, very slow and for about 30 seconds, longer if possible. And just doing a few rounds of that can really help the nervous system regulate, and there's such a sense of calm and safety.
I love all those. Actually, I do always feel so vulnerable. It's so interesting. Like, I don't know if you personally, as a co-regulator, one of the things to think about when we're for those listening, like when you're a somatic practitioner and you're working on someone else's nervous system, we're so sensitive as humans. Like, even as you and I sit here together talking, our nervous systems are co-regulating and they're trying to like read each other in the room, so to speak. And so it's like when you start to build a felt sense awareness of like what's happening inside of your body while in the presence of others, which we're meant to be, it's interesting to think about how co-regulating can change. So like, how are you with your own grief? I know for me, I always have to like practice staying grounded best I can. Like, I am tend to be a little sympathetic energy, buzzing around. And so do you find that you're working on your nervous system at the same time that you're coaching others? And what are your favorite things for you to calm down? Is it also the buzz breath?
Yeah, so that exercise is certainly a personal favorite of mine as well. But I almost do, I suppose, like my own sessions on myself sometimes where I would literally ask myself what I would ask a client, like, what are you feeling right now? Where do you feel it in your body? And then just go from there. It happened just last week, actually. I just felt really out of sorts, unsettled, some of that fight or flight sympathetic energy coming up. Um, and I'd had a tension headache for a couple of days, and I was like, right, okay, I need to sit down and sit with whatever is present here. Um, and within literally about 5 minutes, I'd started to cry. I was really feeling what was going on in my body. I located something in my stomach, which I know from doing work with my own somatic therapist is a place where, um, that's related to my inner child and things like that. And then just sort of naturally followed what my body wanted to do, started wailing, crying, voicing certain words or phrases out loud that felt right. Again, this wasn't really coming from a logical place. It was more from a somatic place of not really thinking rationally, just letting my body do the talking. And yeah, within 5 or 10 minutes, obviously after that release, my tension headache had gone. I did feel tired, but it felt so much better. So I do regular check-ins like that on myself, not maybe religiously, but just as and when I feel something coming up. And then I suppose community has been a massive factor for me as well, of finding people in similar positions who are going through their own grief journeys and have also lost a parent at a young age. Um, and I've built some really strong and incredible friendships with people who that I know I can just pick up the phone to or reach out to, and they'll be there for me. So yeah, it comes back to that co-regulation, which is so important. Of course, it's important to know how to self-regulate, but we're human beings who are built for connection, and having other people to help you in those times is so important.
Yeah, I so agree. I think community is really important. And I think in your grief, it's very helpful to have a mirror to say, like, I see you. I also was in that space, and you're not alone and you're not crazy, because a lot of it makes you feel so overwhelmed that you do feel like you're the only person in the world that's feeling this lack of control, and that the rest of the world is fine and moving along, and you're just standing still, stuck in this just hell of emotionality. And in terms of somatic work, it's so interesting. Like, I've always been drawn to embodied practices. I am a Pilates teacher, and trained students for years and years and years. And it was funny to like look backwards. I'm like also kind of the same as you, and like I have introspection on the backwards, looking back there, like, oh, that's probably why I fell in love with Pilates, because it was the first time in my entire life that I had ever been inside my body and solely focused on the way that the muscles were working. In Pilates practices, you really can't let your mind run too much, because you're so focused on your alignment in your body that you just stay out of your head and you stay right in those body sensations. And I used to leave those sessions early days and be like, I feel like I had just taken a vacation. Like my brain felt like so relieved to not be in the chatter that is constant. So it's interesting, like, now to look at how I've evolved that into a somatic practice, and like what it looks like to sit inside the body. The craziest thing, just for the listenership, for both of our listenerships, really is, you know, recently my husband, I had encouraged him to see a somatic experiencer, and he's seeing this trauma therapist who also is an SE, and he has a lot of PTSD residing around his wife's sudden death and the imagery that comes up with that. And one of the things that his SE is doing with him, his therapist is doing with him, is teaching him to sit inside of the imagery of that moment. So you bring up, like you're in a film, the moment of trauma, and there's always trauma images like that. It'll be this snapshot in your brain that you have of an image, and you take the image, and then you feel the emotion surrounding. So like, what do you feel inside your body? Well, I feel my stomach. Okay, well, what if your stomach had a feeling? What would it be? And if the feeling had a color, what would that color or texture be? Because really, our the somatics of our body and our nervous system speaks in almost adjectives, right? And like imagery and colors and in textures, and then you image this color, texture, whatever your body attaches to. Each of us orient towards a different kind of sensation. She'll have him replace it with like, this is like the pendulation, right? Go to your happy place, go to a place that brings you, ease or peace, and then start to feel your body in that, and like see if you can bring that color, bring that texture, bring that energy, and have that take over while the negative or the PTSD color texture is draining out of your body. And it's so interesting, like how that completely will bring up these emotions. Like, do you notice in these practices when you're doing it even for yourself that like all of a sudden you're in your stomach, you're in your tar energy, like it's sticky, it's feeling nasty in your stomach as you're working through your grief or whatever the sensation is. And you're like, the wisdom of the emotion that's attached there comes up. And it's like, sometimes I get these things, these drop ins, and I'm like, this makes all the sense of my life. And I've been doing 7 years of talk therapy, but all of a sudden, this one line, I'm like, oh, that's why I've been having so much blockage or what. It's crazy. Like, have you experienced this? I'm always blown away by my body, truthfully.
Yeah, 100%. I've definitely experienced that. And I've had a few of those light bulb moments where, like you say, I've done years of talk therapy, which is helpful to an extent. But with somatic work, I feel like sometimes in a couple of minutes you can have this massive breakthrough and realization, and suddenly everything clicks into place, and you have this massive realization of maybe one of your biggest triggers, or why you've been feeling a certain way, or things like that. And that never fails to blow me away, of how quickly you can cut through to, I suppose, the subconscious mind,
Mhm.
just by tapping into the body, and, like you say, speaking through things like colors and textures, or even sometimes sounds, or once you sort of identified one of these parts, asking, and how old is this part of you? And it's incredible how people will very quickly just go, this part of me is 4 years old. I don't know where that came from, but I know that this part of me is 4 years old. And you don't have to necessarily have a memory attached to it, but just being able to connect with that inner 4 year old and feel certain things can be so healing and powerful for people.
It's so true. And I was wondering, when you sit inside of your own loss, what do you feel like you found in your own body is speaking to you? Like, is there certain, so I notice in my grief, I'm always in my throat, like it's always in my throat, and almost even in my glands. Like I can just feel this pulsation when my grief comes up. And I was wondering, like, have you noticed a pattern in your own grief, and other practices that you are able to do to kind of calm your grief so that you don't develop an autoimmune disorder? I mean, obviously we're all, I think we as women are really highly at risk with all the pressures that we carry. And often I think our anger, as you said, is, in a society that we live in, it is not acceptable to be an angry woman, although there's a lot to be angry about.
Yeah, you're completely right. There is a lot to be angry about, but there's this sense that I think has been wired into a lot of us, that we're not allowed to be angry. We've got to be sweet and kind and calm, and that's how we survive in the world. And I think a lot of women may resonate with that. But I'm here to say it's okay to be angry and release your anger in healthy ways, because it will literally benefit your health and your nervous system. And in terms of my own grief and how that feels in my own body, yeah, it's funny you say that you notice your own grief sort of in your glands and your throat. I feel mine quite a lot in my jaw, and also like sort of my solar plexus area.
Yeah.
My If I'm sort of sitting with it and focusing on it, my solar plexus area will just, all the muscles around there will just completely tighten. It's really interesting. I'm not 100% sure why it does that, but there's just this like tightness. And I think I uncovered that there's a lot of guilt there in terms of my own grief. So that's something I've worked through. And yeah, like a lot of anxiety that's still there. It's only been about 5.5 years for me. So it is a long length of time on one hand, but on the other hand, it's not that long at all. So it's still very much a work in progress. And I think just as you feel like you're in a good place with your grief, and you've maybe um yeah, been doing a lot of work on it, it's almost like new level, new devil, where some other devil will pop up again. So it's just trying, for me, it's trying to get comfortable with the unpredictability of it. And yeah, there's times I can go for months and feel in a good place with my grief, and then one day something completely random will just blindside me. But it helps me know that I have the tools to know what to do when those moments happen.
Well, I think it's really cool to, hold that duality. And I think the thing about being a griever, and especially as us as experiential as we are in our practices to help others, it's really exactly what you're saying. So you might be completely falling apart, but also healing and happy. So like they sit right next to each other. And I think when I look out in the grief world, and to be honest, you know, I go through just probably like the regulation of a nervous system. It's like a sine wave where you have these activation moments and then you're so happy, And I think in my own life, or even as a practitioner, I often we'll get to these places where I'm so connected to our work. And then there's places where it's so hard internally in my own grief journey. And I don't want to be judged on it, and I get sensitive about it, that I want to run away from being on this platform in general and maybe just be at home and love my children. So I don't know if you experienced that, but it's interesting how we can be in both. So for the grievers that are listening, you're going to be activated. You're going to be having grief. And sometimes underneath your loss, which there's so many losses in the world, you have trauma from your childhood. So it's like you're missing your father, who may have never been available for you or his own grief. And like I experienced that the same very thing, where I missed my husband and the father of my children. But the truth is we struggled sometimes to connect because of our own woundedness. And so it's interesting how there's like this duality of all these like positive emotions and healing, and then all this sadness and grief. And it's really hard to contain all that in life. And so if you're suffering out there, I would say, I imagine Steph can relate. I know I do. And somatic work is really simple because you don't have to get always to the cognition of every part of it. It's nice to sometimes not mind fuck it all, like I'd rather sit in my stomach and my solar plexus crying out to me sometimes than try to make sense of all of these very hard and out of control and up and down things. I think it's nice to be in expansion and contraction and just be with the body sensation. Sometimes it feels a lot easier than the trauma.
Yeah, 100%. And I think some of the things that may come up when we're doing this somatic work, like you say, can, yes, be related to the grief, but also be related to the past and your childhood trauma and how your parents were with you. And it can all be like a tangled web, I suppose. There's not one feeling that comes up, doesn't necessarily just mean there's one reason for it. There can be multiple reasons that pain is there. And I guess that's the beauty of somatic work, is that it's sort of connecting with a multitude of things at the same time, as opposed to talk therapy where you are just sort of talking about one thing at a time.
Well, it's so funny. My therapist is an SE, and she's trauma informed and does EMDR, and it's always interesting to me how she chooses what modality we're gonna work on things with, and it's always somatically driven. But some days I do, I am an out loud processor, and so some days I'm like, "Dit, dit, 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 dit," like I want to talk it out, But the more that you might notice in your clients and yourself, and for the listeners out there, notice when you tell your grief story, how your body activates. Like, I think the biggest thing that we can teach our clients and those of you grieving to work on is to watch your body response as you're getting activated, as you're telling your story. What's happening inside your body? Is your heart racing? Are you feeling your solar plexus like right between, on your chest? Are you getting pressure? For me, I'm always like clenching up in my throat and feeling this pulsation in my, almost like my thyroid glands are like like running a race. And the truth is, I've suffered asthma my whole life. I'm on an asthma inhaler every morning, and I think to myself, like, do I have asthma, or do I have anxiety that is manifested in my throat? And my body's like, the minute I get stressed or worried about something, I constrict in my throat. And the truth is, I don't know if I have asthma. If I do some like somatic work and calm it down a little bit and sit with the emotions that need to be witnessed, often I can breathe a little bit better. But breath work is not always the best thing for me, because if I'm doing like pranayama kind of yoga, like really intense breathing where I simulate sort of asthma stuff, I start to be like, "Ooh, I got to get out of here." But in an opposite way, I need to slow down my breathing and get to like more of a calming kind of breath. So it's interesting how all these things are connected, and we don't always make sense of it all, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that everyone is completely different and everyone's nervous system like likes completely different things. Like you were saying with your when you try breath work, sometimes that can actually trigger you. It's similar
Mhm.
actually. And there's no one size fits all when it comes to this stuff.
So true that you're saying that. And I actually love that you said that you work in the outer edges. That's a really beautiful phraseology to say in regards to somatic work for like lots of layers. Anyone who's like a really long time practitioner would agree with that. because it's cool that you say that. Like, in fact, when you're coming from a trauma place and you're thinking about your body as a container, sometimes it's really difficult to sit inside of your body. So for the listeners out there who might be struggling to like meditate, right? Like you're like, oh, I can't even sit here for 5 seconds. I gotta, like, if you're a goer, it's going to be challenging for you to sit right inside of the sensations for too long. Like you might, if you find yourself focusing on anything internally and you're like getting more activated, yeah, sitting in the outside container, like making sure you feel where your skin is, or your shirt on top of your skin, or even the chair underneath your body, and orienting outside of the body is a safer place to be. And the more that I'm doing this training, the more I'm learning about, I've always used the five senses to help my clients ground, but it's interesting that when you look at the science behind it, orientation, so how we move through the world in our senses is the animal part of us, and it is where we heal from trauma, is orienting. So how do we see the world? How do we, and what we're practicing in somatics is how to be a little bit more in the here and the now. It's really freaking hard.
Yeah,
Sounds simple, but it's really hard to be here, and how much of your body and your spirit is in this now moment. It's really hard.
yeah, it sounds so simple, but actually just being present in the present moment is really hard, and also something that feels very threatening, I think, to a lot of people in their nervous systems. I think a lot of us live in our heads, sort of worrying about the future or rehashing things that have happened in the past. So the thought of actually sitting in the body in the present moment can A, feel completely alien, and B, to a lot of us feel um, threatening, because we may have picked up in the past, in our childhood, for example, that the present moment wasn't safe. So that's where we've learned to disconnect and, live in our heads or go into that freeze mode. So that's why it's so important for me when I'm working with my clients to really start at that outside edge. Um,
Mhm.
and take it really slowly. So, because the last thing we want is for someone's nervous system to be overwhelmed and find that too difficult. So there's times in sessions where I can tell that someone does really need to take it slow, and I'll do things like literally just ask them to sit and wiggle their toes or wiggle their fingers and see how that feels, just to very slowly build up that trust in the body and build up that nervous system safety that, okay, I did that. I wiggled my toes for 30 seconds, and okay, that was okay. Maybe I can try moving my whole foot now, and just very slowly building up, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And I think it's not just like, there's millions of hours of research behind this, that when we're in a trauma response, or when you're in the far end, right? When you're in that high tone sympathetic response, or even the dorsal response, so like so frozen and frozen functioning, what you're saying, a functional freeze, that's like you've been frozen for so long, but you're just like, your body is making motion and you are not with your body. You're done. You've left your body. And like, I think you're right. I think that is where the disease process starts to come in. Your body's like, listen to me, come back, come back. So sitting inside your wiggle toe is coming back, right? And like, it hasn't been safe for you to come back prior to the toe wiggle. And so just making small connections with your, hey, like, I'm going to tap. That's why the tapping, like, everyone's like, oh, tapping is so powerful. And I'm like, I always was like, what's the science behind tapping? And now I totally understand that. Well, you are literally hitting sensation of your skin, tapping all over and saying like, I can feel my skin on this side. I can't feel my skin on this other side, which is super weird, right? Like, you don't even know, like, certain parts of your body are disconnected. And from from a Pilates standpoint and a muscular standpoint, which is all connected to like the fascia and the whole body, but we talk about this in Pilates a lot. It's like, if you pull a muscle or have a massive injury or surgery, your body recruits, opposing muscles or near muscles. And eventually, if the opposing muscle takes over for so long and you don't learn to go back or put your mind on that space of injury, your body will literally reroute like it doesn't exist, like it died. And
Mm.
you have no sensation or muscular activation from that spot until you Like, so what we teach in Pilates sometimes is like, put your mind on your injury space and just see if you can connect to it. Like, can you have any activation in the skin, underneath the skin, maybe in the muscle? Maybe you can eventually like move it more, or like you can feel it. And so feeling it is the first way to get the nerves and the neurons firing to that space and get that to awaken. And it's the same with trauma response. It's like, okay, can I sit in this for a second and then go away from it and come back to it and then go away from it and come back to it? Maybe I can go a little longer, and maybe I can build my capacity to sit inside of this trauma vortex. And then I go into like, most of us need to build our capacity to sit in joy. We're pretty comfortable sitting in our trauma story. For me, I'm like, my current project is like, can I be safe in happiness? Can I be safe in joy? Can I be safe in the fact that I am in a beautiful, loving marriage and I'm still shocked and not sure? Like, I'm like, is this going to die too? Like, it's like, that's the hardest thing to sit in sometimes, is the happiness.
Yeah, it's such an important point. And funnily enough, one of my clients just this week was talking about something very similar of, I feel in such a good place now, but this feels so alien to me. What do I do with it? It's as if there's a part of me that is enjoying the joy and the peace and the calmness, but there's another part of me that is on guard and still hyper vigilant that something's going to go wrong and I'm going to lose this relationship too, or this happiness is going to end because it always does, and things like that. And we can catch ourselves in those loops. And I think that is a really difficult part of the healing journey um, to find safety in that joy and that peace. And I think when you've had a lifetime of a dysregulated nervous system and um, potentially chronic stress or living in some sort of survival mode, it is like completely rewiring your nervous system and your brain and your body to find safety in that and not always be looking for the other shoe to drop or what next bad thing is going to happen.
It's so true. I mean, we do all of our retreats are on this. It's like teaching the clients at the retreat, and they have such like this, unicorn amount of space. It doesn't happen in the real world, where you're like, okay, we have 7 days. We want you to orient. We want you to sit inside of your felt sense experience. We want you to feel what your body feels like in peace. And then, can you really feel okay to let peace and ease come in? And it's really hard. It's really hard for a lot of us, where you get on that rat wheel where you're like going and the hamster wheel's running and you're just running. And I think most of us, especially women, we have a lot on our shoulders and we're handling a lot, multitasking all the time. We have a hard time unitasking, monotasking, and we have a hard time getting off that wheel, the hamster wheel, and just sitting still inside of our feelings. It's really scary. It can be, because when you do sit inside of your feelings, you might realize that like a lot of your decisions in life have been trauma response. And maybe we're not really happy, and maybe we really got to change a lot to get to the place of peace, and I think raise your hand if you've been guilty of, when you sit still, things need to change. Both hands up on this side of the room. But I will say that we don't have to change everything overnight all at once. It really can just start with like, okay, I want to sit in my life and feel, where do I feel a sense of ease, connection, and safety, even if it's a small amount of ease? And where do I feel resistance, contraction, and like I am not safe? And I think that we can make decisions from that space. We can say like, yeah, with this friendship here, I'm safe to connect. And with this situation over here, I don't feel safe. And like, what do I need to do to either, is there a way to get to safety? Is it me? Or do I need to change my relationship and my setting and my job and some things? And like, it's interesting when you start to look at the body's propensity towards connection and safety. Usually when you feel that way, it's like what people say is manifesting. I'm like, our mind is powerful, but is it manifesting? Or if we're in our embodiment, we are safe. Yeah, the world is going to open up for you, because your whole brain is open to work there, and you can fully love there, and you can fully be in connection. And I think it's really hard if we're not in safety yet, we got a lot of roadblocks stopping us from getting our joy and getting our money and getting our career and getting our love life on task.
Yeah, 100%. Because I think when we're moving from a place of dysregulation and making life choices based on trauma responses and acting from a place that isn't from a sense of safety, or maybe acting out of fear, but at the time, maybe not even realizing it. Before you know it, you've chosen the wrong relationships, the wrong friendships. You're maybe not thriving in your career or your job. And um, it's obviously going to be hard to find a sense of safety in that. And I think what you touched on just a second ago is that realization that I think a lot of people on a healing journey have, where you do sit down and look at your past and suddenly everything clicks of like, wow, I've I've been acting from this unconscious place of trauma responses, and that isn't actually me. That's not my true self. That's the little 6-year-old living inside of me that's too scared to really put herself out there and is making all of these choices. And that realization of, wow, okay, this is overwhelming because I've got a lot of work to do, but I'm armed with this knowledge now that can help me find true safety.
Yeah. And you know what's cool is a really dear friend of mine a long time ago had this hilarious realization. She's like, you can't know what you don't know until you know, you
Mm,
know? And I think that's really true. It's like the more you know about yourself, yes, maybe there is more work to be done, but it's okay. And I always think like I'm working on forgiving myself. I've had a lot of relationships that have fallen apart for lots of reasons because of the way that I acted as a trauma response, and the way that I got into relationships created a lot of codependency. And then, of course, naturally some resentment on the back end of that. And then naturally, when I pulled away, they fell apart. And, just this week in therapy was interesting. Like, I had a lot of anger and sadness around these relationships that really were, and it's okay. Like, I really looked at it this week and was like, I have to forgive myself. I was in a trauma response in the middle of my husband dying of cancer, in a lifetime of abandonment issues, where I just really didn't think I was able to be lovable without giving out so much of myself. And my primary responsibility moving forward is to make sure that I say what I need, and that's not being selfish. It's actually, when I'm in relationship now, if I'm honest and I'm centered on my healing, I want to give all of myself that I can in those relationships in an honest way so that it's sustainable. And yeah, it's really hard.
yeah.
All this stuff is really hard.
It is really hard. I relate to a lot of what you've just said. I think a common theme with my clients as well is relationships, particularly romantic relationships. And I think, we can fall into the trap of ending up in relationships that are traumatic and, feed into that trauma response. But as you said, move into that place of self-forgiveness and self-compassion and acceptance for ways we may have behaved in the past and situations we ended up in. We were just doing our best trying to survive based on the knowledge that our nervous system had. That's the way I see it.
And that's such a beautiful way to put it. It's like when you're in a survival skill, and let's look back and even with, our losses, right? We wish we could have been better humans and more informed, more of a helper to understand how to help our loved ones. The truth is that we were in a survival response for a reason, because it was more than we could handle at the time in our nervous system. And so the nervous system has to work in really slow paces. And it's really nice if you think about it. As scary as slowing down is, because I'm a person that is for some goddamn reason, petrified of slowing down. Every time I slow down, it's exactly what I need, but I have the hardest time not overworking myself. And yeah, it's just when you slow down, you really are able to be with the world you live in and who you are and your loved ones. And I think as well as I do, like at the end of this life, when you were with your father in his last moments and I was with my husband, he sure as hell wasn't worrying about work,
Mm.
money, external shit that we fill our days with. And yeah, the
Yeah.
nervous system cares about connection and safety.
Yeah, it's so true. It really is so true. And I think giving ourselves that patience to learn how to slow down when for a whole lifetime we haven't known how to do that and we've been operating in these survival responses. I think patience is the key to teach yourself how to do that. And yeah, just what you touched on earlier about yeah, in like my dad's last moments, yeah, he wasn't thinking about work or anything like that. But I think just sort of touching on his trauma story and how the chronic stress that he lived with just a couple of weeks before he did pass when he was in hospital, he was still on his laptop trying to desperately get work done, really stressed, trying to ring clients. And I think that's just testament to like how deep these trauma responses and how deep that survival mode can go sometimes when yeah even 2 weeks when 2 weeks before someone died when you know you're in hospital you're really unwell and his thought was work rather than just focusing on his healing. I think that says a lot about how trauma in the nervous system can then lead to physical illness as well.
Well, that's a lot. That's a lot to consider. And thank you so much for being so vulnerable to share. It is really hard when you love someone. And I think it's really crucial, and maybe a good ending point is like when you love someone, the duality of their life isn't, for some reason, the world wants us to have them presented in the most perfect way. And you and I are sitting talking about our dearest loved ones who struggled with perfectionism and overworking, clearly. Even to the end of their life, they were burning out in work and stress, which obviously potentially was I think, a contributor, and so do you, to their disease process. And yet, you really want to think about the fact that that is the opposite of what maybe they needed to do. And it's scary, but we don't need them to be perfect after their death to love
Mm,
them. We don't need people to be perfect to love them. So I wish in the grieving community and in the non-grieving support systems, when we speak about our loved ones in an honest manner, I think it's like almost and where I know this is not going to be a popular opinion, but I think it's the most loving thing you can do is to honor the person for their journey and maybe the gift that they've given us without their without necessarily knowing is teaching us to maybe be an ounce different and really work on ourselves, because that's really all we can do is to learn from their journey so that we can be more present and available to our life now. And I think it's okay. Like, you know, my
yeah.
husband was not perfect. Your dad was not perfect, nor am I. And I think it's interesting that whenever I bring these things up, like learning from his working spots, it's people don't really want to talk about the truth after someone's died, and that's hard too.
Yeah, it's really true. It's almost as if people gloss over the human part of their loved ones that have passed that aren't perfect. But me, I find, I suppose, some sort of comfort in just embracing all of that and for the human experience that it was. And I suppose um not a positive spin that I put on it, but something that I've learned from that experience is how I can look after myself and go about my own life. And when I do catch myself overworking or maybe a bit too stressed and I haven't, taken the time to do something for my nervous system, I do think of my dad's experience and it brings me back to help me live my life in healthier and yeah, more suitable ways for myself. So I suppose that's a gift that he has given me in a way.
Well, I love that. I think that's a beautiful way to end. So the grievers out there listening, when you feel that your life is spinning out of control and you're losing balance, as we all do, look at the walk that your loved one had in their loss and consider the ways that you can work on not following in the unhealthy patterns that your loved one may have gone down, because that in itself is an act of love. And I think it's important, as speakers of grief and, holders of grief, and support people in grief, that we allow people to be human, as you said, and allow them to be flawed and allow all of them to be loved, the good, the bad, the ugly. It's important that we get to see all dualities in grief. And I'm so excited, Steph. So just maybe give a little shout out to the listeners on how they can find you for maybe some one-on-one work. I'm assuming you work mostly in one-on-one coaching.
Yeah, so at the moment I just do one-on-one coaching. So the best place to find me is over on Instagram. I'm at Feels Like Healing on there. Feel free to just drop me a DM or reach out on there. I've got some updates coming to my website soon as well, with exciting new things coming and potentially new group projects and a membership project coming as well, which I'm really excited about. So yeah, to anyone listening who's resonated with any of this conversation, I'd love to hear from you and connect with you.
Well, it couldn't have come in a better week. It's May. I know at least the women and the mothers of the world right now with kids are ending up the school year here in the States. And honestly, it is a busy time. And you have reminded me today to slow down. So I really appreciate this talk. And yeah, you guys can find all of Steph's connecting points in our show notes. And she sounds like the most badass somatic practitioner out there. So, in my opinion, I love to have a practitioner who's experienced grief when I'm walking through grief and trauma, and keep, paying attention to the body, as she said. So we're really trying to fight disease processes, and it really starts in managing your soma and managing your sensations. If your body is talking to you to take it down a notch or get some resources, it's time to downregulate. And Steph is a perfect person to help you do that. We also have lots of resources at Wake Wellness, so you know where to find us. Thank you, Steph. I hope we get to talk again. You have been amazing.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me. That was a really lovely conversation.
Well, you're amazing. And I hope that the world gets to connect a little bit more with you. You sound amazing. So thank you so much for your time and so much vulnerability about your story.
No worries at all. It was so lovely to connect with you. And yeah, we'll keep in touch.
If you enjoyed this episode of Wake the F Up, please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Wake community by downloading our app. Just search for The Wake Wellness in the Apple or Android App Store. And follow us on Instagram at The Wake Wellness. Thanks for listening.